So, thanks to a recent interview by Thomas Maroney with Trek Central, we know that the Ark Royal is going to be a science carrier. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit because generally, whenever a new science carrier is announced, it always brings out a certain discussion about how science carriers need to be buffed. The general thing around the community is that, well, they need a secondary deflector to be properly utilized in the game. I don't agree with this. First, let's talk about what makes a science carrier a science carrier. Well, first, it's set up kind of like a science ship. It's got a commander level science seat. It's only got 6 weapon slots, usually in a 3-3 layout. Sometimes there have been 1 or 2 carriers that have a 4-2 layout, like the Talaru, but that's not really a common thing. But despite being set up like a science vessel, they lack a secondary deflector slot, which makes a lot of that science seating not quite as great as it could be, largely because the a secondary deflector does a lot to buff a lot of your exotic abilities. You can use it to buff control, you can use it to buff your various exotic damage like radiation damage and stuff like that. But without that secondary deflector, a lot of those science abilities aren't going to do quite as much as they would on a normal science vessel. The trade-off for science carriers is that instead of having a secondary deflector, they instead get 2 hangar bays. Now, the problem's always been that until fairly recently in the game's history, pets have never been a huge game changer. They've always been this kind of amusement kind of thing. They've never done a huge amount of damage. It wasn't until probably since like the introduction of superior area denial, the starship trait off the mirror angle, that pets really started to make a difference in gameplay. And we've gotten more pet stuff over the past year or so. Like we've got the Type 7 shuttles, which are absolutely amazing for their ability to debuff enemy targets. We got a number of different consoles and starship traits to help buff pets. Like we've got the advanced engineering consoles that will buff hangar pet damage. We got several other universal consoles that will benefit pets. We've gotten starship traits like flagship staffing or cooperation is the dominant strategy, and really cool traits like repurposed cargo bay hangar. But obviously, these aren't things you're going to be able to get right away. Like the advanced consoles, you're not going to be able to even get those until end-game level content, where you're able to either grind them out yourself by crafting them through the game's R&D system or by buying them off the exchange. And even then, re-engineering them is going to be a pain in the butt unless you manage to be lucky enough to find ones with the modifier that you actually want on them. And then the other consoles, like this is probably the only one that's really easy to get. Swarm Matrix. Everything else here comes off of a ship. Like this comes off the Hydra. This comes off of the support carriers. This comes off of the Jirok, which was an event ship. So if you missed out on that event, you don't have this on an account unlock. The only way to get the Jirok now is through a Muds bundle, which is a huge ripoff for an event ship. And then there's the Fleet Power Network Array, which comes off of the Awani here. So while carrier gameplay is in a much better spot than it used to be, it's not exactly the most free-to-play friendly game mechanic. And despite all these things that we have gotten that benefit carrier gameplay, actual science carriers themselves still generally fall short in terms of actual performance compared to other starship types in the game. Like, for example, a flight deck carrier is always going to outperform a side carrier in most roles. And this is why the discussion of buffing side carriers always comes up whenever a new science carrier is announced or released. A lot of players just aren't satisfied with how these things are set up. Like, yeah, the pets are fun, but being limited to only 6 weapon slots with no secondary deflector, it's a lot to deal with. However, like I said at the beginning of the video, I don't think that adding a secondary deflector to science carriers is the way to fix them. Mainly because it completely devalues other science vessels that actually have a secondary deflector. Like, why bother flying a normal science vessel that only has 3 weapons layout and a secondary deflector when you could fly a science vessel that has 2 hangar bays, which would essentially be what science carriers would become. They would effectively completely replace normal science vessels. Another problem with that line of thinking is ships like the Vovine here. The Vovine, while technically being set up like a normal carrier, having a 3 weapons layout, is technically not a science carrier. This is an engineering carrier, meaning it does not have a commander level science seat. It has a commander level engineering seat. So adding a secondary deflector to this thing would serve very little purpose to it. Now, another idea that gets thrown around a lot is adding a 3rd hangar bay to science carriers, or I guess any carrier that has only 6 weapon slots. And again, this is another one that I don't agree with, mainly because I think that one ends up getting out of control. Like, you look at some of the pets that have been released within the past few years, they've gotten very powerful, especially when accompanied with certain starship traits. Like this, the pet setup I have right here right now is already very powerful with the Type 7 shuttles. I mean, can you imagine 3 hangar bays full of the Type 7 shuttles? That is, like, 2 is already an insane amount of debuff. Adding a third in there is just going to be absolutely overwhelming and would likely end up with them putting some sort of cap on debuff as like a whole. So you'd probably only be able to get like so much debuff onto a target. And then once we're in that territory, then people are just going to be pissed off for a different reason. So why even bother going there in the first place? Whenever I talk about how adding a third hangar bay is a bad idea, inevitably someone always brings up the recent trait off of the Typhon, repurposed cargo bay hangar, which effectively adds a third hangar bay. And actually, we just saw the Vovine, like its full set, technically adds a fourth hangar bay if you have both of these on there, because that adds like 8 of the Swarmer pets onto your build as well. But the important thing with those ideas is that they only add certain pets. Like the repurposed cargo bay hangar here only adds advanced versions of the Valkyrie fighter squadron pets. So you're still restricted with what type of pets you have there. So that's still a limitation that, introducing this kind of, this quote unquote extra hangar bay through a trait or a console set does. It limits it to a certain type of pet, keeping certain restrictions and, keeping some semblance of game balance in mind. But you just leave a third open hangar bay slot. You can put anything you want in there. And like I said, most people are just going to put in more Type 7s in there for the insane amount of debuff they give. And then if you do that, you open it up. It sets too many dangerous possibilities, in my opinion, for what would come next to that, because you end up putting that much debuff out, and then it's gonna cause problems, I think. And by problems, I mean nerfs. Once you get to that point, either they're gonna, like I said, they could put like some sort of cap onto how debuff works, or they could end up further restricting how much hangar bay pet abilities do, or just weakening hangar bay pets overall, because 3 hangar bays just ends up being crazy. Just like with adding a secondary deflector, I feel like adding a third hangar bay to these kind of ships just kind of sets a dangerous precedent that is just going to open up the game to future problems down the line. Now, like I said at the beginning of the video, I don't disagree that carriers do need some sort of buff. And when I'm saying that, I do just mean like normal carriers, like science carriers, or like the Vovine, an engineering carrier. Anything with only 6 weapon slots and 2 hangar bays. They need some kind of buff. Because like flight deck carriers, they don't need a buff. Dreadnought carriers, they don't need a buff. It's just these that I'm talking about. And I feel like the solution is not in adding more gear to these things, but it's actually in buffing some of the existing gear, that being the hangar bays. That does not mean adding more of them, it just means making the existing hangar bays more powerful. So the idea I had to buff carriers is actually inspired by how raiders work in Star Trek Online. See, with raiders, they're for the most part just like normal escorts, but they do have some different advantages and disadvantages compared to normal escorts. For one, the raiders are missing an aft weapon slot, but the trade-off there is that not only do they have an abnormally high amount of universal seating, but they also have a hidden damage buff called raider flanking. What raider flanking does is that anytime you are firing on an enemy's aft arc, you will be doing additional damage to that enemy. So despite missing an entire weapon slot, raiders can potentially end up doing even more damage than your typical escort, because they are getting that extra damage buff if you are, being mindful of where you're shooting at your target. Plus, they have a lot more flexibility in their bridge officer seating. This is what I think normal science carriers need. They don't need an extra hangar base slot. They don't need a secondary deflector slot. They need a hidden innate buff that will further buff the hangar bay pets. Maybe give them some extra damage, give them some extra damage resistance, maybe lower the cooldown a little bit. Actually, cooldown reduction on the hangar bays might be redundant because the carrier mastery package already gets that. But you get what I mean, though. Something to further make the hangar bay pets that you get that much more effective, instead of just adding more of them, or taking the ships in a completely different direction by giving them a secondary deflector, but effectively just making them science vessels with 2 hangar bays. I like this idea more because it helps carriers maintain their own identity. That way they still remain carriers. You are still more reliant on the hangar bay pets than, just some kind of special ability build like you would commonly see on an EPG build, which, is typically something you see on a science vessel. And again, this innate buff that I'm talking about should only be something that goes onto science carriers or really any carrier that only has a six weapon slots. So flight deck carriers, they don't need this. Flight deck carriers already have they're basically cruisers, so they've already got 8 weapon slots. They're already pretty tanky because they're effectively cruisers. They are missing some of the command frequency auras, but that's not really a huge drawback because they've got the 2 hangar bays to make up for it. Same with dreadnought carriers and escort carriers. They're just set up like more tactical focused carriers. They're just missing a weapon slot, and I think the experimental weapon too, but in turn, they are getting 2 hangar bays. But science carriers don't have that extra special thing that gives them a little bit of an edge that the other carrier variants have, because all they have is the 2 hangar bays. Everything else is just kind of meh because they've only got 6 weapon slots. They have a bunch of science seating, but no secondary deflector to buff said science seating. So they need something to further give them a bit more of a push. And why not just feed further into the whole pet gimmick? Because they're carriers. That's kind of their whole thing to begin with. But yeah, that's just my opinion on the topic. I'm sure plenty of you are eagerly typing away in the comments section to tell me how wrong I am. So whatever. But yeah, hopefully someone at Deck is listening. Maybe they think it's a decent idea because, again, I don't think secondary deflector or an extra hangar bay is the way to go. But I do think something needs to be done to help out normal science carriers like this. And I think an innate buff to pets, kind of like how raiders get raider flanking, is a good way to go. But again, that's just me. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. And while you're down there, like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. If you'd like to further support the channel, hit that join button, become a member for extra channel perks, or find the link to the merch store down below, or hit any of the affiliate links in the pinned comment. Any of those really help me out, and I really do appreciate it. Either way, though, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.